What if we move to a sustainable society?
What if gas were $10 a gallon?
What if everyone voted?
What if everyone had health care?
What if?
What if?
What if? What if?
What if?
What if?
What if?
What if?
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the last in our What If series for this year. This is What If Everyone Voted? And we've got a great panel who's going to talk about different aspects of this question. My name is Pete Damiano. I direct the University of Iowa Public Policy Center and want to welcome you to this event. But we have not been able to do this without a number of community sponsors and people that have worked with us to get the word out. And I want to thank the Iowa City Public Library, Johnson County Livable Communities, the Iowa City Area Chamber of Commerce, the League of Women Voters of Johnson County, the Iowa City Press Citizen, Hills Bank and Trust, and PATV, who has been filming these, and these will then be shown on PATV, but they'll also be available on the website at the Public Policy Center. If you just Google that, or it's just ppc.uiowa.edu, and as soon as those are available, we'll be able to post those. Also want to recognize Mayor Matt Hayek and City Manager Tom Marcus, who's there, and my boss in the back, Dan Reed, who's Vice President for Research for the University, and sort of represent what this is really all about, bringing together the expertise of the university together with the community and try to share in an interesting discussion. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Fred Bemke, and Fred is a professor in the Department of Political Science and also directs the Social Science Research Program at the Public Policy Center, and he will introduce our panel.
All right, thank you, Pete. Well, having attended the previous iterations of this series, I'm excited to sort of be in charge of one of them, I guess, although I don't want to take too much credit because I have a wonderful set of panelists here. We're going to be able to provide a very broad and diverse set of perspectives on the questions that we have for you today. So our goal in setting up this series of what-if forums was to try and provoke discussion. And so for the politics one, the social science one, I thought that we would engage in a discussion about what would happen if everybody turned out to vote. And I think there are numerous consequences of that some of you may have already thought of that I'm hoping that the panelists might spur a little bit of reflection about. So I've asked our panelists to just talk for a few minutes within the areas of their expertise to highlight some issues that they think would be particularly interesting. While I think that people voting is generally a good thing, I've reminded them that it's not always a good thing. As we were preparing to do this, someone pointed out that because there's so many people on the roads on election night, there are more car accidents and more people get hurt. And so it's not always a positive thing. We should keep that in mind. There are costs to these sorts of things. I'm thinking Travis may have a greater sense of some of the actual costs of administering elections if 300 or so million people show up on election day. I thought what I would do briefly is provide a little bit of context about turnout after I introduce our panelists, and then let them talk for a few minutes. So on the far end, we have Sarah Brook, who's a professor in the Department of Sociology. To her right, we have Bob Cargill, who's in the Department of Religious Studies and Classics, departments, two separate departments. Travis Weipert, who's the Johnson County Auditor, and then my colleague, Carolyn Colbert, in political science. So as I said, I'm going to start out by doing a little bit of an overview, just to introduce a couple of themes and set the stage with a little bit of data. Unfortunately, this PDF software does not have a full screen mode, and 6 people have now tried to find it, so I'm fairly confident in asserting that. So I can't make the slides any bigger. And I apologize for that, but I think you'll be able to get the general idea. So I just thought I'd describe kind of both the historical and the current sense of turnout in the United States. And as a brief aside, maybe talk about it in international context a little bit. So what you can see here is just a graph of turnout in presidential elections. I've eliminated midterm elections from this just to avoid the sort of up and down. You could assume that those are all about 5 to 10 percentage points lower in the 2 years between all of these. So you can see a pretty high consistent rate of turnout in the 70 or 80% in the 20th century, in the 19th century, and then it drops down. And there was a lot of concern in political science about what was going on in the 70s and 80s and early 90s, and then that started to turn around a bit. And so we've actually, turnout in the last couple presidential elections has gotten back up to sort of the average about 40 years ago in the late 60s. And I'm being sort of broad with these figures, so don't be too nitpicky if you search. There's many, many ways to define turnout, among whom these are all voting age population, so that doesn't count for citizenship. And as some people have pointed out, the recent decline looks a little bit smaller if you compare it to voting eligible population. So if you account for the fact that in many states, such as Iowa, felons can't vote, and of course non-citizens, et cetera. But that only explains a couple of percentage points. So then I thought I would highlight some of the inequalities in turnout. I think this is kind of hopefully going to form the linchpin and related sort of inequalities or differences in turnout of many of the questions that we might think about today, in terms of how it might affect elections and what else happens after those elections. So if you look at turnout by race, again, I'm not correcting for citizenship here, but you see broadly similar trends. If you do, you see big differences by race. Again, in particular with white and blacks turning out at fairly high rates, and then Asian and Hispanics, of course, there's a greater correction for citizenship there, but you still get a large gap. By age, this is something the students in the room, I think, will both know about, and also be aware of all the attention lavished on them to make it their big election every year, and finally turn out and make a difference. But you see a very consistent increase by about 20 year intervals over time. These are all averaged over about the last 10 or so presidential elections, just to give, again, a broad trend. Education, the more education you have, right? As a political scientist, I can tell you one thing we're pretty sure about, is that wealthier, more educated people vote and participate in politics at a much higher rate. I have absolutely no doubt about that. And so all of these things are borne out by the data. Again, the more educated you are, the more likely you are to participate in elections. And finally, employment, I thought that might be related to some topics of interest. So almost a 20% increase in participation among those who are employed as opposed to those who aren't employed. And then, again, just to bring it back to Iowa City, perhaps, from the national to the local, I don't want us to think just about national politics when we think about what would happen if everyone voted. I want us to think about how that might affect all sorts of different elections. Not just presidential elections, where already a fairly large percentage of people, this is actually percent registered as opposed to the previous one because of how the data were available on the Johnson County website. So they mimic a little bit higher. So we have very high turnout rates for presidential in Iowa City, dropping a bit for midterm elections, and then pretty low, 20% or below, mostly for state primaries, local Iowa City elections, as well as local school elections. And we were talking about earlier, that can fluctuate a lot depending on whether or not there's a referendum on whether or not people who are 19 can be in the bars and ordering drinks and such. So with that, I have sort of a list of questions. We're not going to start talking about them yet, but this is kind of some of the things that I thought of when I went over this. I'm not going to read all of them. I'll put them back up later after our panelists have a chance to meet, but just to kind of go over the general ideas here. I mean, how is this going to change campaigns? How is this going to affect parties? How is this going to affect the way parties govern, or the kinds of policies that they end up passing? How is this related to income inequality and taxation policies, social safety net, policies to help the poor and the less well-off, election administration, right? You have to deal with all these people coming. We've already got lines during presidential elections in St. Louis where they have to keep the polls open for a few extra hours, and that's with turnout rates, roughly half of what I'm describing. And then, what do we think about what it would be like if everyone voted? If everyone wanted to vote and was interested in participating, then they're probably going to go out and hopefully learn about the political process and be relatively informed. What if we just kind of forced them to vote, like compulsory voting in many countries, and perhaps they felt a little more put upon, as if there was, shall we say, a turnout mandate, a personal turnout mandate. And they might be less happy about that, and so they might not be quite as motivated to be involved. That could lead to a very different set of decisions made on election day and a different tenor of participation. And of course in Iowa we should think about the caucuses, how that would be different if all the Democrats showed up to the Democratic caucus, or how state and local politics would change. There would be a gymnasium large enough to hold all this. I'll just add this as a brief aside. I was in Nebraska the first year they did caucuses. I actually caucused in Iowa and participated in, but didn't caucus literally in the Nebraska caucuses. And I was in an auditorium in Omaha, and I think the room I was in had 3% of the entire caucus population for the Democratic Party for the entire state of Nebraska, because it was in Omaha. There were over 1,000 people in the room, And we counted ourselves off one at a time, 2 or 3 times. We got some things to teach in Iowa still about how to do a caucus of a lot of people. Okay. Carolyn, do you want to go next?
Sure.
Okay, let me know when Carolyn has a couple slides that I've added in here, so just let me know when you want me to put them up.
Okay. So let me get mine. I have 5 minutes. And it's hard to talk about this topic in 5 minutes because for people like a lot of political scientists, we care a lot about this topic. And I always say economists care a lot about markets, and we want to see free markets and a lot of money made. And political scientists, we care about democracy, and we want to see people participate and be engaged and vote. And so these are and in the arts, they care about expression and artistic value, and so we all have different values. This is a value of our discipline. So lots of books, lots of research has been focused on this topic for many, many decades. And 2 things just to keep in mind, if voter turnout in presidential elections hovers at about 50% of the population, you can think of a coin or think of a circle and cut that in half. And think of for every 1 person who votes, 1 person doesn't. If the people who vote look exactly the same as the people who don't vote, it really doesn't matter if half of us stay home on election day, because those who vote can represent the interests of those who don't vote, and there shouldn't be any difference. But if there's a systematic difference and the people who vote look very different than the people who don't vote, then we could have a very skewed political system that would represent half the people's preferences and not the others. So Fred just highlighted one of the key things that we know, and that is that individuals that have lower incomes, education, racial and ethnic minorities and the young are much less likely to vote. In presidential elections, you see the highest turnout. If you go down to midterm elections for Congress, then about only 1 in 3 Americans vote. If you go down lower to local elections, you saw 20% vote. And actually turnout in the Iowa caucuses, even in 2008, that incredible competitive election, it was only 12% of Iowans caucused in 2008. So that's just to show you how low. The other thing we know about that coin, the half who vote and the half who don't, the half who do and the half who don't, is that people who don't vote tend to be much more likely to be moderates and to be independents. That means that our political system elects people who tend to be more partisan, strong liberals, strong Democrats, and are less likely to be moderates. Okay, so with those 2 things in mind, hopefully Fred will just highlight the 2 graphs I wanted to show you. This is a graph of party polarization in Congress. You guys have seen this because I showed it in class today. We often call this, but what this is showing is that if you look at how polarized the Democrats and the Republicans are in Congress, from the 19th century all the way up to the present, we're in one of the strongest periods of party polarization that we've seen basically since the 19th century. There are almost no moderates left in Congress, not in the Senate, not in the House. And we know that the result is that we have a lot of stalemate and status quo policymaking. And then let's see if we get the Gallup one. This is actually the percentage of the population who identifies as Republican, Democratic, or Independent. And right now, for the current period, we're at a record 42% of Americans are independents. More say they're moderates. The percentage of Republicans and Democrats has gone down. That means that large segments of the population are not being represented in government. So we have extreme party polarization of elected officials. We have most of the population who looks at themselves as moderates or independent. And then let's just look at the last one. And just one other big trend here, I don't know if you guys have seen, this is the Piketty and Size data, the economists from Berkeley who are looking at trends in income inequality over time, again from the Gilded Age, the robber barons of in 1917 up to today, 2012. Income inequality is at a record high, matched only by the Gilded Age. And right now, the top 10% of Americans are taking home basically 50% of the income. The top 1% are controlling 20% of the income. So huge income inequality. Okay, so The question is that if the population of voters looked more like the population of Americans, would they elect different elected officials? And would there be different policies adopted? Maybe more moderate policies, maybe policies that would address growing income inequality. And there are many policies that can address this. Raising the minimum wage, raising taxes on the wealthy, regulating the banks and the financial sector. So there's a whole lot of policies. Okay, so now we come to the last part in my, let's see, I'm almost done in my one minute, is that I've been teaching class here at U Iowa on election reform or fixing America's electoral system, and many people in my class are here, so good job. And the question is that in 5 or 6 things, what could we do that would be the quickest or most effective way to increase voter turnout? One would be automatic voter registration with a social security number. The federal government gave you a social security number when you were born, and you have to pay taxes or you will go to jail. And they could allow you to be automatically registered when you turned 18. Voter registration is having to register to vote is one of the biggest extra hurdles that in the United States we do. Number 2, election day registration is one of the reforms, allowing people to register and vote on election day. Iowa has adopted this that has been proven to increase voter turnout, and not just that, increase the turnout of low income, poor, young, so address the skew. Nonpartisan redistricting. Iowa's good on this too. We're one of the few states with California that doesn't have gerrymandered districts. Most states, especially go look at Texas, have extremely gerrymandered districts where there is no competition because the candidates who are in those districts are going to win. The Electoral College depresses turnout significantly. It really only matters if you live in Ohio, Florida, Pennsylvania, and maybe a handful of other states. Most of the population lives in safe states, California, New York, and Texas, where there's no incentive to vote, not even in a presidential election. And we have other reforms, so we'll talk about those later. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Carol. So why don't we just keep moving along in order? Travis, would you like to go ahead and follow up?
Well, I don't know how I follow somebody that hit on all the issues that I wanted to, but I guess first I'll start out. Not to be joking, but I have been traveling the last couple of days, and I finally got to see my wife for the first time in I don't know how many days today, and she said, "Where are you going tonight?" And I said, "An election forum. We're going to talk about what happens if 100% of the population showed up and voted." And she goes, "That'll never happen. I answered your question, why don't you stay home tonight?" I thought that was kind of funny coming from my wife. But no, I mean, she hit on a lot of great points, and I guess from an auditor's standpoint, for us, if 100% of the people showed up, we're looking at all kinds of extra poll workers we need. And I've been whining about this to the state, and I hate to use the word whining, but we don't have the money we need as a county to handle the elections we have. I mean, I see Rod Sullivan's back there, county supervisor, and it's the county that pays for elections, but it's the state that has all these mandates that require us to have X amount of equipment. All this equipment has to go through their testing phase, and they tell us what we need to have, what we need to use, but they don't give us any money, to provide that kind of equipment to the voters. So when we see the long lines, or we have this archaic equipment, I get those emails from you, the citizens, saying, "What are you guys thinking? Why aren't you, doing this or that?" Well, unfortunately, we can't. We were just out in Denver this week for a conference, and the biggest holdback right now when it comes to election equipment is the federal government does not have enough staff members to go and certify equipment. They're telling us now it's taken 2 to 3 years to get the most up-to-date machines through testing. Well, can you imagine if we had 100% people show up, and we use what are called M100s here in the county, and they were certified before I was born. And not to say my age, but I was born in 1981, So we have equipment that was certified before 1981 that's being used in our polling places right now. And absolutely, it works fine. I mean, we don't want to get rid of it, but I mean, if we had, imagine the lines. Today, and not to pick on Matt Hayek now, but I said to a couple of staff members, what happens if we had 100% turnout? And one of the staff members looked at me and said, well, 21 would be back, or would be overturned. Sorry, Matt. So, I mean, I threw this out to the staff. They laughed too, and I hate to hear that when, my own staff members in elections laugh that 100% turnout is ridiculous. I mean, why is that, why is 100% turnout not the goal? Why? And you hear everything, we were out at Clear Creek Amana yesterday registering seniors, and we had, I think, 50 kids register, and they were all ready to vote. But, so why aren't people voting? And, we hear all these excuses, and, we need to find a way to get people to the polls. And I told the students yesterday, you don't have to vote. Even if you show up and vote a blank ballot, it still counts. It shows you voted. If you don't have an opinion on an issue, at least come out and vote. Help us out, show that you voted. And to me, it's not, we want 100%, and I think we can get there. I truly do believe we can get there. But a lot of it is people are scared, they don't know how to vote, they're like, well, I don't have an opinion on an issue. Even if you don't have an opinion, you can come out and vote with us and, put in a blank ballot. It still counts. I mean, in the state of Iowa, a blank ballot, it'll go in the machine and say, hey, you didn't vote, it's an undervote. But at the end of the day, when we do all of our tallies, it shows up in the system that you showed up that day and voted. And it counts towards the 100% that we're looking for. So, I mean, a lot of it to me is education. It's hard, we're trying to get in the schools, like I said, and technically, if we did get 100%, I don't know what we'd do. I'd probably be out of a job because I would have lost my mind when 100% of our eligible voters showed up and voted. I think our whole system would have collapsed for the night. But, I mean, we're getting there, and I don't see any reason why we can't get 100%. I mean, seeing some of her statistics, it's a shame we don't have more people voting. But on the flip side, I give Johnson County credit. We see a lot of towns right now setting records when it comes to voting, which is just awesome. And we're not seeing that across the state. I was just talking with the Polk County auditor, and you'd think Polk County, pretty heavily Democratic, they would have a lot more people voting. They don't. They can't get people to their polls, even as a heavy Democratic county, and nobody wants to vote. We're here. We're setting all kinds of new records in some of our last city elections. So, 30% to me, a lot of people go, wow, 30% in a city election, you guys are doing great. Where I'm like, well, until we get to 50%, you're not going to hear me, out there waving the flag going, we're getting people voting. So.
Okay. Thank you very much.
I actually wrote some prepared comments here, so I'll read those to you. Of course, they gave me the least controversial topic, the role of religion in politics. So we'll take a peek at this here. The role of religion has recently resurged as a regular political topic in national elections. Ironically, it did so during a campaign in which the conservative Republican candidate, Mitt Romney, a devout Mormon, attempted to downplay his religious affiliations with the Mormon Church without ever denying them, mostly by making more general, almost deistic references to God, his church, and occasionally Jesus Christ. In fact, a Gallup poll from June 2012, just before the election, showed that 4 in 10 Americans did not know that Mitt Romney was a Mormon. Of course, evangelical support for Romney was tepid at first, especially during the primaries, where conservative evangelicals even looked favorably at 2 Catholics, Rick Santorum and Newt Gingrich, in an attempt to assuage their own religious fears of voting for a devout Mormon. Of course, once Romney had secured the nomination, many evangelical Christians came to his support. Romney even managed to secure the support of the famed and very aged evangelist Billy Graham late in October 2012, but only after the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association delisted Mormonism as a cult on its website. Thus, in stark contrast to the successful presidential campaigns of George W. Bush, who openly ran as an evangelical Christian and who was rewarded with 2 terms as president by voters, some have suggested that Mitt Romney ultimately suffered by being a Mormon candidate for president because many evangelical voters decided to stay home on election day. I disagree with this, but that's the claim by many. On the Democratic side of the election, many conservative Christians routinely attempted to paint President Barack Obama as a Muslim with the hope of using negative views of Islam in America to scare away voters who might potentially vote for him. President Obama, who rightly understood the role of religion in the election, actually switched churches after controversial comments made by his former pastor, Reverend Jeremiah Wright. As a result, President Obama also spent a great deal of time interweaving religious language into his campaign speeches. But to address the specific question posed by this forum tonight, what if everyone voted? I would have to argue that there would have been no difference in the outcome of the presidential election had everyone voted. Simply put, Mitt Romney won all of the states, particularly in the Bible Belt, that any increased number of evangelical or Mormon voters would have tipped in his direction. That is to say, President Obama won the areas in which evangelical voters have a lesser amount of influence, specifically the West Coast, the Great Lakes and Upper Midwest region, and the Northeast. And if we juxtapose a map of the recent American Bible Society and Barna Group survey, which ranked the most and least Bible-minded cities in the U.S., which I argued on Iowa Public Radio with host Ben Kiefer recently, actually defines Bible-minded as religious conservative. And by the way, which listed the Cedar Rapids Waterloo area as the 5th least Bible-minded city in the U.S. Or if we juxtapose any number of recent studies using different criteria to rank the most and least educated states, we find that the least Bible-minded cities correspond to the most educated states, and curiously match almost identically with the 2012 presidential electoral map, with the most Bible-minded and least educated states going to the Republican candidate, and the least Bible-minded, that is, the least religious conservative, and the most educated states going to the Democratic candidate, President Obama. Thus, I would argue that had everyone voted, the results would have likely been identical to the result we actually had in 2012. And that is, of course, for a national election. I would argue, however, that religion did play a role in the 2012 senatorial campaigns. Specifically, the conservative Christian partnership with various Tea Party groups actually cost the Republicans, I would argue, the U.S. Senate, because they backed very conservative and often very religious candidates in the Republican primaries who defeated candidates they believed to be too moderate, conservatives. Karen mentioned earlier, we're losing our moderates, and they defeated these moderates that maybe could have beaten Democrats in the general election, who then turned around and lost to the election to the Democrats, often because of debilitating gaffes that can be traced back to religious beliefs in addition to fiscal policies and personal perception. I'm thinking specifically of Todd Legitimate Rape Aiken's loss in Missouri and Richard Rape Pregnancy is God Wills Murdoch's loss in Indiana. And when we couple these losses with Tea Party losses in 2010, senatorial special election in Delaware, remember Christine O'Donnell? I'm not a witch, right? And in Nevada, where the Tea Party Express backed Southern Baptist Sharon Angle, who defeated a moderate Republican Catholic, and who was a favorite at the time to defeat Harry Reid, Sue Loudon, before losing her election, that case could be made that conservative religious views may have cost the Republicans the Senate following the 2010 and 2012 elections. At the end of the day, the polling data do not lie. Numerous polls are now demonstrating that an increasingly number of scientifically minded, left or moderate-leaning, free-thinking young people who are raised on the internet and therefore do not necessarily receive all of their information from the traditional religious authorities like parents, priests, preachers, etc., and are therefore more likely to have their ideals challenged at an earlier age, are increasingly rejecting organized religion and either identifying with progressive religious groups or rejecting religion altogether. Going forward, while acknowledging that religious affiliation will always be used as a political tool in elections, I believe we're going to find an increasing number of people who dismiss a candidate's personal religious affiliation as a criteria for candidacy as long as that religious affiliation does not impact the policies and laws they're attempting to pass. Thank you.
All right, so I get to wrap this up, and I will try to go quickly because thank you all for coming out, and I really hope that this is more of a conversation than us speaking at you, so I'm going to try to speak fast, but if you have follow-up questions, ask me because I really want to hear what you guys have to say. So I'm going to make 5 brief points, and I'm going to make 5 because I have both a sociology background and a public policy background, so I'm going to try and hit on both of those things all at the same time. Okay, so the first thing, and some of the things I'm going to say are a little bit echoing some of the things that Carolyn introduced for us, so I'm really happy about that. So the first thing is, what is the broad concern? Like, what's the main issue? Is the main issue that we want 100% turnout, or is the issue inequality in turnout? And so as a sociologist, I care deeply about inequality in turnout, not just whether or not everybody is participating. Obviously, those are related. But I think mostly about the inequality of the participation or the turnout, whether it be voting or another kind of participation. One of the things that I would say about this is this matters for what the principle is that we care about, right? So many people care about democracy, and if you care about democracy, you might actually care about either, but you know, the whole one person, one vote, or some sort of equal consideration of all of our preferences would be something that we might all care about for either reason. So in terms of inequality and participation, one of the things I would say is it's persistent. So even though this graph in terms of income inequality shows huge changes over time, especially in the last 20 or 30 years, inequality in political participation has persisted for at least 20 or 30 years, probably even, well, so it started in the 60s even. So it precedes when the uptick happens strongly for income inequality. So even with lower levels of income inequality, we still see SES gaps, or differences in the affluent versus the not so affluent voting and participating politically. So the whole problem is not just economic inequality, although I do hope that we talk about the relationship between economic inequality and political inequality. But so I'm just going to say now, it's persistent. So political inequality is persistent over time. So it's not just, it just happened in the last couple of years. Second thing, though, about political inequality is voting. So Fred showed us turnout. So voting is highly unequal. However, if we look across different types of participation, so all sorts of political voice, whether you communicate in other ways with politicians or donate to campaigns or any other number of ways that you could participate in the political system, voting is the most equal of those. So if you're offended by how much inequality you saw with voting turnout, get more offended about the fact that that's the most equal of all of the ways that you could participate. Okay? So substantial. So persistent and substantial in terms of political inequality. The second thing I would say, though, is, so there's a difference between participation and inequality in participation and inequality in representation or responsiveness of elected officials, right? So one reason we might care is that the people who participate have different preferences than the people who are elected, right? Or that they're elected by all of us, but then when they're elected, what do? So that's sort of an issue of responsiveness. So we might just care that all of our interests are represented. So unfortunately, a different aspect of inequality in the political system is inequality of responsiveness. So there's a lot of research, mostly in political science, that shows responsiveness is actually extremely unequal. When there's a divergence, when there's a difference between lower income and middle and upper income people, elected officials, especially senators, are more likely to vote with the middle and upper income people, right? So, and we can look at this. This is an empirical issue. I'm not claiming something that's not empirically valid, right? So that's a second thing to care about in terms of inequality. It's not just who votes and who participates, it's what's the representation of interests look like when it actually comes to voting on real policies. Okay, so this brings us to the consequences, right? So some of the things that we care about are related to inequality, the things that I care about. But you might only care, like Carolyn said, you might only care if everybody votes, if the people who don't vote or don't participate are different, either demographically or in terms of their preferences and interests, than the people who do vote. Because if they're the same, it doesn't matter, right? If 50% voted or 100% voted, if they're the same kinds of people and they have the same preferences and interests, it doesn't matter if 100% vote. Unfortunately, we know that actually that's not true. When we look at non-voters versus voters, they actually do have different preferences in terms of public policies. So, as Carolyn mentioned, they tend to be moderate, but they also tend to be more liberal. So when it comes to things that public policy people care about, what's your attitude towards the role of government? You know, how expansive do you see government being? Do you think that the government should be playing a role in providing services? What do you think the level of spending should be for different social programs? What are the different public policy preferences that you have in terms of social welfare benefits? All of those things tend to be more liberal for non-voters than they are for voters. So what that shows you is that those non-voters, if they did vote, actually the outcome might be different in terms of the public policies that are enacted, right? Okay, so the last thing I would say, drawing really specifically on my public policy background, is we normally think about public policies, and everything I've said so far is all about public policies being the outcome of the political system, right? So we elect people, they vote on things, and then we get policies, and then we have outcomes associated with those. However, another way to think about public policies is the fact that once they're enacted, they actually influence the political system after that. And so it's a policy feedback effect, right? So it feeds back into the political system. And the specific thing that I'm going to say about this sort of general process is there's a line of work that I do, and many people in political science do, that looks at how your interactions with government affect your willingness to participate and your beliefs and sort of attitudes about government generally. And so some of the research that I've done and many others have done shows that the types of programs that you participate in and the policies, the ways that they're designed, matter for whether or not you walk away with a very negative sense of government and you're much less efficacious and you're way less likely to participate both civically and politically. And there's other government programs for the same population, same target population, that when you're treated with more respect, more democratically, you're actually more likely to participate. You have a much better sense of government. You think that the government is there to serve you, and you're much more likely to participate after that. And so my last sort of point is to say, it's not just about individual characteristics, it's about the experiences you have, and specifically the experiences you have with government that actually affect how you think about government and whether or not you're going to participate.
Thank you. Panelists have done a very good job of keeping their remarks stimulating and relatively brief. So that means we have nearly an hour left for audience questions. So pressure is on you, I guess, at this point. Feel free to jump in, raise your hand, ask a question. I would ask first that you try to make sure you speak up. We're being recorded for television. If anyone who has a question they'd rather not have themselves appear on television, grab a piece of paper, write it down, and send it forward to me, and we can do that. And then panelists, perhaps if the question needs repeating or something, or a quick summary, since you all have microphones, that could prove useful, but just feel free to jump in as you wish. I saw a hand going up over here.
So question, early one of the graphs showed, and I don't remember the exact number, but I'm going to say 30% self-identified as Republican, maybe 30% as Democratic, and a large percentage is independent. Effectively, which way do the independents go? I mean, independent is not on the ballot. You've got to make a choice. So speak to that.
Because we have a winner-take-all system, basically, the single-member districts winner-take-all system for legislatures, and then a winner-take-all system for the president, our rules make it so that we really have effectively only two parties that can ever win in office. Other countries have different rules, and then they can have multiple parties. So we have two parties because our rules make us have two parties. We used to have the Whigs, then the Whigs faded away, and we got the Republicans, but we still mostly keep two parties. And this large proportion of independents breaks they lean down, they will break with the Republican Party or break with the Democratic Party. And in fact, in surveys, we often ask people who identify as independents, we give them a follow-up question and say, do you lean Democrat, do you lean Republican, so that we can see what they actually end up doing when they only have those two choices. I really believe that a lot of winning in American politics is appealing to these independents. So Obama was very successful at appealing to the independents in 2008 and 2012. That helped him get elected. And in fact, Bush's argument was he was a compassionate conservative, and that helped bring independence to Bush in earlier elections.
No, I was gonna say, I agree with you 100%. The one thing, and this question came up today, I had a student at Clear Creek, Amana, senior, say I'm an independent, and he started talking about the parties. He's kind of like, why do people pick a party? And I told him, I said, it's one of those things that as auditor, I'm finding as people get a little bit older, they start gravitating one way or the other. It's not so much they want to stay middle of the road, but when you're a younger person, and I know I kind of was that way, even though my parents raised me to be a hardcore Dem, and somehow I still ended up a little bit independent. They kind of go down that independent route until, even though they're 18, they start to feel out which party they want to go to, and then all of a sudden they kind of gravitate that way. And I can see it today with some of the 18-year-olds. They were like, well, I'm an independent, and you started talking to them, they were starting to talk about their beliefs, and you could tell which way, I could easily see, like you said, Bush as the conservative, it might appeal to a lot of them to veer to the right and become a Republican, so.
People are arguing that right now, the 2016 election is a really interesting time because it's a window right now for a candidate, if they are able to kind of speak a different language right now, a more moderate language, a language about building bridges, a language about it's not a Democratic solution or a Republican solution, but it's outside of that box. Because especially young people are increasingly identifying as independents. It's a future trend.
But I'm wondering how much the primary system destroys this, because I've been a registered, not affiliated for some time now. I also think it depends on where you live. When I lived in a very, very conservative county, Fresno County in Central California, I said I was a moderate, and they look at me like, you're a closet liberal. And when I moved to Johnson County, and I said I'm an independent, they said, you're a closet Republican. It's code. But I agree with you 100%. I think that especially young people are looking for some kind of moderate, some kind of someone that will say, I don't really identify with my parents Republicans or my grandparents Democrats. I want to be in the middle. But the primary system, the way that it's set up, destroys this. It gets rid of a lot of the moderates, unless you do something like California recently did and just have open primaries and the top two win. I mean, is that the solution? And I asked the political science folks. I mean, is that the solution to get rid of the primaries? Or then how do businesses vet which candidates they really want to be if there's no primary?
I was actually going to follow up on the question. I think this will sort of follow along on what you're asking there. If moderates were to turn out at a higher rate under our situation, all of them were to turn out, would there be room for a third party? And would our primary system be possible? If you knew that all the moderates were going to turn out, then perhaps you wouldn't see so many candidates that people have thrown out to run as moderates over the past 20 or 30 years, either draw back or not be able to raise the resources. They didn't think they could make a compelling campaign. I mean, we could support a primary with another set of party on there if we just had enough people in that party to keep it going and keep staying on the ballot. Does anyone up here on the panel think that there'd be a chance for that? Or?
Well, I mean, we technically had the Libertarian Party on the ballot up until 3-4 years ago when they didn't meet the state law, the 10% threshold. I know Colorado right now has Democrat, Republican, Libertarian, and the American Patriot Party all on their ballot. A lot of it is you got to get people out to vote. We're sitting here talking about getting 100% turnout. Well, if you go out and register as a Libertarian, there's a Libertarian on the ticket for governor, you can easily get over that 10% threshold, and then you're on the primary, or you're on the ballot going forward. So, a lot of it isn't what we do, it's getting the people out there. I mean, like I said, the libertarians were on the ballot here for a while in Iowa, and they just, I hate to say it, failed to show up or continue to show up, and they lost their spot at the table, if that's, you know, how you want to put it. Like, so
one thing that's kind of interesting is that our system right now, and we learn, we're pros on this in our class, is that because we have basically this winner-take-all two-party system, anyone who supports a third party is basically faces this spoiler effect, where if you vote for Ralph Nader, you're going to destroy the Democrat stance. If you vote for Rand Paul, or no, Ron Paul, you're going to destroy the Republican stance. And so a lot of independents and third-party people suppress their true preferences and vote for one of the major parties. And that's because our system really only allows it's a winner-take-all. So some states, I'm going to talk about this actually tomorrow, thanks to Fred, but some cities are experimenting with this idea of a ranked choice ballot or an instant runoff ballot. Minneapolis and St. Paul do this. San Francisco does this, where when you go to the ballot, you get to mark your first choice, your second choice, and your third choice. And if your first, if any candidate wins the majority of the vote, just for first place ballots, they win. But if nobody gets a majority, then they go down and they reallocate, they count the second and the third choice preferences. It's a way of allowing people who have other preferences to be able to voice their opinions. There's maybe some evidence that turnout can increase. It's pretty simple, actually. You just think about it. It's like going to the ice cream store and saying, I'd like chocolate. If you don't have chocolate, I'll take strawberry. If you don't have strawberry, I'll take vanilla. And we do this all the time, but we only, in politics, say, you got chocolate or nothing.
So, I'd like you to put back that first graph you showed. That one. That graph, I've seen it many times, and I didn't really understand what was going on until I started researching my book on voting technology. Broken Ballots is the title, by Jones and Simons. But what I found is there's a huge change in the way we vote starting in 1892. The change to a universal Australian secret ballot, which is to say the right to a secret ballot. With that comes much better ballot accounting, and with that comes much better ballot security. Basically around 1900, plus or minus a decade, there's a complete sea change in the way parties cheat in elections. Before 1900, the accepted approach to cheating was ballot box stuffing and paying floaters to go from polling place to polling place to polling place and cast ballots. The very few good studies of how many ballots were fraudulently cast in that period, but one case, Harrison County, Texas, was really well studied because they had federal marshals taking over the elections. And they found 30% of all ballots cast in state and local elections in Harrison County were fraudulent. After 1900, the way you cheat in elections is to reduce the turnout of your opponents. We institute voter registration systems. We try to make it so that the undesirables can't vote. And I strongly suspect that the step between 19th century participation levels and 20th century participation levels largely has to do with that sea change and doesn't represent a genuine change in the nature of our democracy. I think on the whole we're more honest now than we were before World War II. But things have been wildly corrupt for a long time. So I want to warn people about looking back to the 19th century as a halcyon era when there was a lot of participation. I don't think it was so good.
It's a lot easier to pay someone to vote a certain way if you can see their ballot and see how they
Yeah.
vote. But as I recall, there was a lot more rum at the
Yes.
at the polling box in those days too. They would just have a party there all day and get people to come vote.
That's also why Iowa doesn't allow you to take a photo of your ballot when you vote. So
Right.
nobody can pay you.
Sorry.
Can I say one sort of, I guess, more serious response to that is, I mean, so one thing that I do appreciate about that comment is the idea that if you want to say it really harshly, suppressing other people's votes. But if you want to say it another way, I mean, in the not very distant past, we don't have to go back to 18 whatever, to talk about efforts to make it so that it's harder to vote. In the very recent past, we've had local and state officials and elected officials have different types of things that they can do to make it easier or harder to vote. So it's not just about whether or not somebody wakes up and decides to vote in the morning or whether they have an interest or a motivation to vote. It's also about the context in which they're sort of operating. So there are structural constraints or environmental incentives that make it easier or harder for somebody to exercise their democratic right. So everybody has a right to vote now. Obviously, not everybody votes. It's not all about personal preferences. Some of it is about institutional differences across local and state areas, and some of that has seen drastic differences in the not distant past, right? So we've seen efforts across different states and local areas to make it more difficult to vote in the sense of having more restrictions on what you have to do in order to vote, right? All the voter ID laws and restrictions that are now on the books or being contested in different states and local areas, I think is a more recent and realistic thing for us to think about in terms of where we would fall on that issue.
Gerrymandering has been mentioned, and with the 48 states that practice it, it seems to me that if you are in a district that is gerrymandered in a way that is not in accordance with your political views, you're very apt to stay home. And I wonder if any studies have been done to quantify this at all. And if this is true, then there's really no hope of getting even most of the population to vote until this gerrymandering problem is addressed.
Yeah, well, there's lots of studies and over time using all sorts of data that competitive elections increase turnout and for all races. And so, and when you're talking about these heavily gerrymandered districts, gerrymandered Republican or gerrymandered Democrat, you have incumbents that are winning in landslide elections where if there is an opponent, they're getting 20 to 30% less of the popular vote than the incumbent. In fact, a shocking statistic is just the percentage of U.S. House seats that go uncontested. And we often claim how, we're not a communist country, we're not the Soviet Union, and those places have one person on the ballot. But in many of these very heavily gerrymandered districts, where literally a challenger won't even run, we often have ballots, even for Congress, where there's just one name on the ballot. Yeah, it's a problem. Iowa, we can give ourselves credit.
Rod?
I've heard a number of you make comments that, and to some extent I take issue with a common theme that you keep mentioning, which is that there's this polarization between liberal and conservative, whereas what I see is really a choice between moderate and conservative. You're talking about the moderate voices not being heard, and I think as a matter of fact, the moderate voices have replaced what I would call the liberal voices. And that really you have a choice between between moderate and conservative, and it's the liberal voice that's going unheard.
Actually, I would agree with that 100% after talking to a bunch of seniors today. I mean, like I said, most of them are registering as independents, not because they want to be independent, but to them, they don't fall in the liberal category and they don't fall in the hard right category. And you're right, they're more moderates. I mean, they want middle of the road. They don't, as I was talking to a class today, I raised the question to the kids. I mean, how many people in here know where your property tax money goes? The highest part of it goes to the school district. And kids didn't even realize that. They looked at me and said, well, so I should actually show up and vote for school board, even though I don't have kids and I'm only 18. It's like, yes. But, I mean, yeah, no, back to your point, yeah, to me, we're seeing more moderates, but as I said earlier, as kids get older, I'm noticing how they start to veer right or left, but I think you're right. When you talk about the 18 to, I'd even say 30-year-olds, since I'm out, doing election stuff at all the dorms, between 18 and 30, kids are not picking a party. They want to be that moderate in the middle, and it's after that where they become right or left. And I think you're right. I mean, you know, if either party wants to cater to get these voters out, they need to cater more to the middle than they do their hardcore left or right views.
Do you mean that but you were trying to also say that liberals right now don't have as much of a voice in government? I think there was one study that I read that said that Obama's policies, in terms of his policy agenda, was very similar to a moderate Republican of the 19, something like that.
Similar to Nixon.
Right, basically, that it was, Obama, what we call a liberal, some people would even call more than that, a socialist, would be what was a moderate Republican of the 50s. So there has been a shift, right? Is this what you're talking about?
Yes.
Well, if Obama is a socialist, he's doing a pretty poor job because the stock market's in record territory, which brings up corporate influence on elections and on our whole system. And as Rod was saying earlier, you know, I think there was a quote from Ralph Nader that said we have the corporate pro-choice party and a corporate pro-life party. Is the distinction between the two parties. My question is about democracy initiatives that you see springing up around the country. Voters in, money out, move to amend, that sort of thing, to try to get the money out of politics, which a lot of people think is corrupting the whole system. Can anybody comment on these democracy initiatives that you know, address some of them, are voter suppression work, gerrymandering, voter ID laws, which were just thrown out of Wisconsin today, and a few other things about
The states have always been good. I mean, we've always had the states experiment in all of these reforms. During the during the 19th century, it was women's suffrage. It was radical to let women vote in the idea in the 19th century, but the states experimented on them right now, so I'll let someone else talk.
I was going to say, when it comes to voter ID, I mean, my stance has always been, I know quite a few Republican auditors here in the state of Iowa are 100% against it. I mean, if I pulled out my ID right now, it doesn't look like what I did 10 years ago. I hate to say that. And then all of a sudden you're putting that decision making into, and again, I hate to say this, but most of my poll workers are in the 70 to 80-year-old age range. Well, how do they make that decision when it comes to voter ID? You know, they're asking somebody to look at an ID. I mean, heck, look at around Iowa City right now. We have people working the gas stations that are 20 to 30 years old that can't stop people from buying beer, and now you want them to stop from voting? I mean, it just, yeah. So when it comes to voter ID, I'm just not a big fan of it, but I'll let you guys answer the other questions.
I'll comment a little bit on the first part about interest groups and campaign contributions. More generally, this is excuse me, something that I teach a class on interest groups, and so we can go into some depth about the role of campaign contributions. And I think the reason why I think it would be particularly relevant to complete turnout is that a lot of the game today with campaigns, both candidates as well as non-candidate organizations, super PACs, 527s, etc., is about turnout, right? And there's two components to that I want to highlight. One is, obviously you want to turn out your base, right? The campaigns have gotten really good the last decade or so in targeting and micro-targeting the voters that are going to be able to really, really reliably vote for them and go to their doors and try and get them to vote. That all goes away if everyone's turning out to vote. So the campaigns are going to have to focus a lot of their primary activities on something different. Interest groups tend to do a little, there are some groups that will do positive voter registration, nonpartisan, some of it partisan as well, but they're much more able, even than candidates, to do some of the negative advertising. And I think a serious amount of the objective behind negative advertising is demobilization. And there are studies that have shown that people that get turned off by politics are less likely to participate. You know, this is going to be part of the explanation for why moderates don't necessarily turn out as much, because they're kind of seeing it on both sides and they're not really excited about it. And so those groups, because they have, you know, a certain amount of anonymity, you might not know where all the money's coming from, but they're not directly associated with the campaign, they can do these really negative campaigns, and that's gonna affect turnout. So again, if everybody's voting, then that's not really part of the game, right? You can really upset people, but if, for whatever reason, compulsory voting or just interest in politics, everyone's showing up, the game has to change to persuasion. Because you're not gonna win an election by scaring people away from the polls that aren't gonna vote for your candidate. You're gonna win an election by trying to get more people who are going to show up to vote for your candidate. So I mean, one of the things I put up on my questions was whether or not it would lead to more or less negative advertising. Unfortunately, I don't know for sure that it would lead to more or less. I think it would lead to a different type of negative advertising. There might be more contrast ads and of more of the good type, I would say, than just generically referred to as contrast ads. But I think there would have to be more persuasion. I just don't see how that wouldn't happen, no matter where the money's coming from. And so I think some of it would be persuading you not to vote for the opponent, but there'd still have to be an underlying objective to get you to vote for the other candidate as well. So I think it would have an impact on the campaign finance system, but I'm not sure that it would lead to less money in politics, right? I mean, it would change what it's doing, but it would certainly, there'd be a huge motivation to try and persuade people, so there'd be just as much motivation for people to contribute and try and influence elections as well.
We haven't talked about Citizens United here, but obviously recent Supreme Court rulings that define corporations and unions as people, and then we have unlimited campaign contributions, that's another trend. We're right now maxing out on the most money that we've ever seen. $1 billion was basically raised by both Romney and Obama in the 2012 election, and record spending, a record corporate spending. And a new study was just released by Ben Page, who was the co-author, is it Gillen's, that showed that actually elected officials in Congress don't respond to moderates or the low income. They only respond to the preferences of the affluent. It was just released, it's all over the blogs.
Just in general, if you get 100% turnout, what does it even matter if the elected officials then don't vote with their constituency and they vote with their money? So in turnover, you're still stuck with them for the 4 years or the 2 years that we voted them in as 100% voting. So in that 2 years or those 4 years, they're still doing huge amounts of damage, even if they're elected back out through voting based upon who pays them, especially with unlimited campaign contributions and treating corporations as people.
So the question is, even if everyone's showing up to vote, does it make a difference if campaign contributions and the money in politics are largely determining the result of the election, and once people are in office, they're there for the term of their office? Sarah?
I'll just start us out. One thing I would say is you can think about the influence of money and what Carolyn said in terms of impacting elections and who wins. But I think it's another thing to talk about what money does in terms of influence of elected officials that are already elected. So yes, money influences both outcomes, both who's elected, but also the policies that are enacted or the preferences that they vote for. And I would be optimistic. I mean, I know a lot of this is going to be downer, so I'll try to start the optimistic thing right now, which is I'd be optimistic that I actually think that if everybody voted, I do think money in politics is a problem for the front end of this in terms of campaigns and who gets elected and how that happens. But let's pretend for a moment that everybody actually does turn out and not just the people that certain people want to turn out. I actually think that would influence who gets elected. And I think that if the game was different, if the game was that everybody voted, they would pay more attention. I do think that there's always going to be a skew toward, in terms of influence of elected officials, towards the people that have more influence with their money. But I'm going to, just put it out there to be a little bit more optimistic that I think that it would be a little bit, not a complete game changer, but I do think it would change. Right now we have inequality and influence at the who's elected and inequality and influence in what policies get passed. And I think if we changed at least one of those, maybe the second one would change a little bit also in reflection of the fact that the first one changed a little bit.
In religious studies, we often say that if Christians actually did what Jesus taught, what he actually taught, he would look so revolutionary that they would laugh him out of the building, and we might string him up and crucify him again. If we actually did what he taught, he would be so unpopular that he would probably see the same fate. And I think going back to the question about where's the true liberal, if somebody actually went to Congress or became elected and actually served the poor or the middle class and didn't just serve those who helped them, that they would be seen as such a, I'll say the word revolution, it would be such a radical notion that he would probably be treated in that same way. He would immediately be labeled unsafe, a radical, and laughed out of the building. I mean, he really would. What's the solution, especially for younger people, of which I still consider myself one? I'll use the analogy of the hipster, the band that you hear that's really, really popular, and you're cool, and you heard them first, and then they get really big. They actually have some success, and then it's like, yeah, but they've sold out. They've kind of. I'm wondering if that same mentality couldn't be applied to the use of money in politics. That a generation of people actually look at money, record money, being thrown at issues, and beginning to say, you know what? I'm just going to vote against whatever is receiving the most money. The reason they throw the money is that it works. It works. The reason negative advertising always comes, it works. It's very effective. Even though majority of Americans say they don't like it. But I think if people actually started saying, I'm going to vote against I'm going to be the hipster voter, and I'm going to vote against whichever issue gets the most money, I think there's actually a chance. We see this in industry. When certain Microsoft, for instance, back when I was a little younger, got so big that people just started hating them. They're doing it to Apple now, right? They're getting so big that people just started. There is this reaction to it. I'm wondering if that will, maybe I'm being optimistic, if that will actually happen to all of this money. There's so much money coming in that people actually start voting against the money, especially those of us who don't have a lot of it. We teach in the humanities.
Well, and I was going to say, I think that's a good point. You look at the Coralville City election, and Koch brothers showed up with truckloads of money. People were fed up with it. They wanted no part of it. This is our town, this is our election. And like you said, I mean, I hate to say it, you could make the Koch brothers Jesus, but they pretty much crucified him the minute the truck of money showed up and kicked him out of town. And
I don't know if I'm comfortable with that analogy.
Well, like I said, you made a valid point. Yeah, they said we're not dealing with this, and I'll be the first person to say I hate the fact that corporations can give money to candidates or these PACs. I hate it. I think it's a slippery slope where it's just horrible. But I mean, you made the point that I think all along, or as I told students today, the best elections are at the lowest level. Your city council, your school board, your county. And when these big corporations come in and try to influence it with the money, they can't. I mean, people get tired of it. They know who they like. They know who they want to win. And it's going to take some time, like you said, before we start realizing that we can't let them influence the state level, the Congress level, the presidential level. But I do think we're heading down that road. And like I said, I was the first person. I thought the Supreme Court made a horrible decision allowing corporations to give money to PACs. But now I start to see where it's backfiring, and I hope we continue down that path.
A really interesting trend, if you go look at, I'm a real fan of the Pew Research Center and the Pew Center for the People in the Press. And if you go, they do a wonderful, the State of the Media, and they do it every year. And right now, every age group from 50 and younger uses the internet as one of their two primary sources of news more than television. Now, these candidates take all this money from corporations and unions. 90% of that and more is spent on television and media ads. If the population turns off the television, the box, if we turn off the box, we turn off the power of that corporate money to influence what we think. And I just think it's really interesting that the internet is a really dynamic new media environment that's creating different kinds of communication. People are following different kinds of news. And I'm not sure what's going to happen, but that's a positive. Sarah's looking for positives, so I have
I would just follow up by echoing what Sarah said, which is that I mean, as she mentioned earlier, studies have shown that members of Congress respond more to wealthy people in their district, and that's because they know they're gonna vote. I mean, there may be other reasons, but that's a big part of it. And if people across the income spectrum are all voting, there'd be votes in places, and all the candidates wouldn't have to chase the same voters. There'd be a lot more heterogeneity in the electoral coalitions that you could put together to win an election, and I think that would have some benefits. I know it's not gonna solve the problem. People who want to spend money in politics are gonna do it until we stop them. That sounds a little too revolutionary, but you know, until we have laws that make it impossible to do it, they'll find a new way. We have a follow-up?
So there was the assertion that if voting was mandatory, maybe people would be more informed because they knew they had to vote. But I've spent a lot of time working with election officials in Holland, where I observed an election, and working remotely with election people from Australia, where in Holland, voting was mandatory until very recently, and in Australia, it's still mandatory. And what they commented was that the term spoiled ballot, in the United States, we use that term to refer to a ballot which is typically accidentally invalidated and has to be replaced at the polling place. But in Australia and Holland, the term has been applied to protest ballots, which is to say, you're forced to vote. So you go to the polling place and you scroll an obscenity across the ballot and put it in the ballot box. And this is in Australia now a very common reaction. In Holland, when they ceased making voting mandatory, turnout began to approach American levels. My suspicion is that if you really want an informed electorate, we should be voting on fewer issues. And the idea of instant democracy, where we vote on hundreds of issues every year, is extremely dangerous. On a typical US ballot, we have 80-some different issues or candidates, I counted, in a presidential general election. The list of issues gets big on a lot of ballots. And expecting people to be educated on all but a few of those issues is really unlikely. I think that the right to abstain is crucial.
I'll agree with you and say that when I lived in California, many groups, advocacy groups, that wanted to see particular positions would circumvent the legislature by going to the direct ballot initiative, and it was abused. It's a problem in California. I was going to address the second part as well, and it just slipped.
Compulsory protest voting. I'll start talking, and then if you come back to you, just nudge me and I'll stop talking instantly. So I think what you're getting at is there are consequences of, let's play the scenario out, right? What if everybody votes? We could think about positive and negative consequences, right? So some of the I think that's where you're going a little bit, at least. I mean, I'm sorry if I'm reading into it too much, but I mean, so one of the negative consequences that people point to is you'll have less informed voters voting, right? So you'll have people that don't know anything about the 100 things that are on the ballot. So do you actually want people that know nothing about what's going on just to go there? And if they do go there, do you want them just to not fill out a ballot and just, like, have a spoiled ballot or just a blank ballot, but they voted, and that's what we want? We just want everybody to go to the poll, and if you're uninformed, don't vote, and if you're informed, then vote on the 100 things that are on the ballot, because one of the things that people would point to as a negative consequence of like mandating voting, I mean, like, so we have a civic duty, so we all have the right, but we don't really have a strong civic duty that enforces us all normatively to go to the polls and vote, right? So let's say we all do, whether it's mandated or we all feel this obligation. Do we want people to vote that are relatively uninformed or less knowledgeable? I mean, a lot of people that say that this is a negative thing say that we don't want that, right? That that's a bad thing. I wouldn't argue that, but I'm just laying all the options on the table. I think there are more positives that outweigh the negatives, but just to be honest and put all the things on the table, I think we should talk about what the negative potential consequences are and what the positive potential consequences are. The positive potential consequences are, we think that that's how our not just, we have a participatory democracy, but we also have a representative democracy, right? So we actually might vote on 100 things, but our elected officials vote on 100 more things that we don't vote on, right? So we actually do not have a direct democracy. We actually vote on, people, and then they elect, they represent our interests. So many people would say we need a little bit more one person, one vote to have a proper functioning of our representative democracy. Other people would say another positive would be it would build community if everybody would vote. We don't feel like we're part of the polity. We all are doing something collectively to do something, right? Regardless of what the outcome is, we're all in it together and we're all participating together. That builds community, right? It also builds legitimacy in the government if we all participate, right? There's a huge issue of not trusting government or just having a negative attitude towards government. So that's part of voter apathy, right? If we all actually did participate, government would seem more legitimate because we all would actually think that, potentially we had a say in it. So did that jog your memory?
It did,
Good.
thanks. The point was that in decades past, the issue was about censorship, trying to stop your opponent from saying what he's trying to say, and if they are, then trying to suppress the vote. I think the new form of censorship in the information age is the data dump. And that is, if you can overwhelm with just buckets and buckets of information, that it actually becomes so much noise that people actually get turned away. It's harder to find the true issue and the true facts with the data. We see this increasingly in this age, where people will make a claim, it's a false claim, and then instead of retracting it, they'll actually try to dump more and more and more information peripherally. Is that what's going on with some of our ballots today? That a lot of people look at the ballot, the pamphlet that gets sent out, and they go, and maybe it's a little over. I think voters should reserve the right to walk in and say, I actually have spent some time and looked at these 4 issues. These are the most important ones. I'm going to vote these. I'll leave the rest of them blank. Now, you run the risk of then having otherwise informed people not deciding the election and people who are partisan showing up to vote. And that's one of the risks. How do we? I would be for getting it off, taking them off the ballot, basically addressing the problem that is raised by the direct ballot initiative. If we're going to have a representative government, and if we're going to elect electors who are then going to vote for us, make a budget for us, you can't do direct ballot initiatives and then have the legislature create the budget, right? Because you're trying to go through a legislative process to create a budget, but now you've got to pay for these measures. It's you either got to do them both or neither. I think it's a problem. We experience this problem in California, and it's one way to circumvent the legislature, who's actually, I think, if they're doing their job properly, trying to take into consideration how do we pay for certain things. When it's used for social issues, then it's a whole other just banning things that don't really cost money. Then it becomes a real problem.
Well, and I was going to say too, first of all, I'm glad we don't have mandatory voting, because we get enough write-ins that, and most of them, tell me what great job I'm doing, ha ha ha. And second of all, and you bring up something that I've been working with, and I don't want to point Rod out back there too much, supervisor. We have been trying forever, because of state law right now, when you talk about, all these ballot issues on a ballot or going to the polls 20 times. Iowa right now, and I hate to say this, is so archaic when it comes to voting and putting issues on the ballot. You're not allowed to put school board issues on with city council stuff. So that's the reason why we have all these elections. And to me, we're sitting here talking about how do you get 100% of the people out to vote? Well, how do you do that when you tell them every month you got to come out? To me, that's silly. We've been working with the legislature over and over saying, come on, let us combine some of this stuff. So, you go to the poll, even if you don't want to vote on the school board election, you're there for the city one, at least you're there. And if you want to, you can. But, we're going to run into this fall. I think we're probably going to have another school issue right after November. How many people are going to show up after the November gubernatorial election to vote for school, something, like a school bond issue, sales tax issue? I can tell you right now the percentage is probably going to be 10%, 15 tops, because they're going to be like, well, I just voted. I'm not going back out there. So, we need to look as a state too on changing some of our laws to get to that 100% turnout, because people just don't want to go out over and over again. I have people that show up at the office and go, I just voted last month. What the heck am I voting for now? And they don't even know. They go over and look at the sample ballot, but, so, I mean, it just, you know, we need to change some of that if we want to get to 100%.
Starts to feel like a faculty meeting over time.
I just want to comment on this notion about whether or not if you go to 100% voting and you have any potential that uninformed voters are now participating in the process. And I know that in the literature there's about 2 schools of thought in regards to this matter. One school of thought is that, you know, only you should have those individuals who are fully informed, that have complete information, that they're going to make the best decision in regards to not just voting, but other political matters as well. But then I sort of side with the other school of thought that even if you don't have full information, it's okay. You're still able to make a reasoned and informed voting decision, despite the fact that your level of knowledge or advocacy is not at the same level as, say, someone with higher income or higher education. So even if we do go to 100% voting, I don't think that there's going to be too much of a change in terms of the aggregate population coming to what we deem as the quote-unquote correct decision, because an individual who lacks the level of knowledge as, say, another person, chances are they're still going to come to the same reasoned choice as a low information voter would still come to a reasoned choice, just as an individual with high information.
I think I've been mischaracterized.
No, I think what Desmond is saying here is that basically people use cues and voter shortcuts, so they don't have to understand an entire tax policy. They don't have to understand. We use partisanship. That's a major cue. We use endorsements. I like the League of Women Voters. I don't like the League of Women Voters. They say vote for that person, and so you know right away how to vote for. I just wanted to kind of throw this out just for fun, just as kind of a hypothetical. But you mentioned Australia, which has compulsory voting. We're talking another country that is a British colony. And there are a number of countries that have compulsory voting. And how compulsory voting works actually is that if you don't vote, it's kind of like a parking ticket. So you get a little fine. What you are is it's a form of shaming. It's a form of public shaming because it is considered your responsibility in a democracy to vote. Now, lots of, there are lots of countries that put a higher value on voting. And I just think it's interesting, we're not allowed to drive a car without car insurance. My daughter is a teenager. She would say, why do we have to have car insurance? I'm like, well, because you could hurt somebody. If you hurt somebody in that car, we have to be liable for the consequences. Not everybody can see. Recently, now our government, with some controversy, said you have to have health insurance, right? And if you don't pay for it, then we're going to help provide it. What if Americans don't fully understand that if they don't vote, that there are negative consequences? Just like the teenager who doesn't understand why we need car insurance, or maybe the young person who doesn't understand why we need health insurance. Maybe that we don't put this higher, we don't tell everybody this is your responsibility. We expect this of you. So I'm just throwing it out there. Other countries do it. They haven't fallen into the ocean yet.
Well, and I was going to say too, you make a valid point. We've been pushing hard, and by we, a bunch of us county auditors, we would love to see the school districts go to an in-service day for the general election on this year it's November 4th. And as an in-service day, all the teachers would help out at the polls, schools would be closed, and so that's been a big push by the auditors, and we think that would really help with turnout. So when that bill comes up next year, if anybody wants to sign on to it or write letters, we would love to hear from you. So
that's a form of what they call an election day holiday. A lot of countries do not have people work on election day because it's a way of saying this really matters. And
it'd be nice if Iowa was the first state to do that.
So I was just going to have a follow-up to say that I wasn't advocating that I actually personally think that that's a bad thing, that I actually think uninformed people would vote if we made everybody vote. And I was putting let's put everything on the table and try and be objective about their positive and negative consequences. One of the reasons why I don't go with the negative consequence of less informed voters being a problem is not just because people use cues and they don't actually have to know a heck of a lot, because most voters don't know a heck of a lot now, so it's not going to change if everybody does it. We all use the same cues, so let's not pretend that we don't all do the same thing, I mean, to a greater or lesser extent. One of the reasons why I don't think that's a problem is, I mean, in political science, there's a huge thing with what is the knowledge, whether or not knowledge of politics and political things and everything that's going on and just basic knowledge of how government functions, whether or not that predicts somebody voting or whether they actually know what's going on. And that's a huge, I mean, very tenuous relationship. So having more knowledge does not make you more likely to participate. So we already have uninformed voters voting. So the fact that, you know, some of the uninformed are already voting and then some of the informed people are not voting for different reasons, that wouldn't be my stance. I just wanted to clarify that.
Lightning round time, shall we
Yeah.
say? One here and then one there.
I'm currently running for office, and as I'm knocking doors, I get two things from people that are related to this. One of them is a lot of people said that they're now registered as independents to get away from the noise, from the phone calls and from the mail. So they actually do have a preference, but their preference is to not be bothered by the two political parties. And the other thing is, and I tell people you can't vote on Facebook and you can't vote via email, and they said, well, why not? Why can't we register online, and why can't we vote online like maybe Oregon? So maybe that one's for you, Travis.
Well, that's nice of you. Well, first of all, I will say that Johnson County, I mean, how do I put this nicely? Matt Schultz and I don't see eye to eye, the Secretary of State. And I have been, and my elections deputy, we are just, like I said, out in Colorado all week. We are throwing a fit that you cannot register online to vote. I mean, it's ridiculous. In today's age, there's no reason why you can't. Other states are doing it. I think Colorado even told us they're doing it. Why can't you register online? I mean, we allow same-day registration at the polls. There's no reason why we can't have voter registration online. What was the second part? Because you got me on a tangent.
Voting online.
Oh, voting.
Or
Well,
mail voting.
well, mail voting, that's a partisan issue. Republicans are going to tell you that you're mailing out ballots to dead people, and you know, just the other day I got a call from the Lynn County auditor. He was upset because some lady signed for an absentee request for her and her husband because somebody showed up at the house and said, hey, you guys want absentee ballots? And she just signed for both. Now, you know, they're claiming that she committed voter fraud. Well, there was no intent there. She didn't mean that. You know, so that's where we stand with mailing out ballots. I'd love to. The problem is it's very expensive, you know. And the other thing is, and this is another hot topic with me, is I want the state of Iowa to be able to say, or for people to write down or tell the county auditors, every election I want you to mail me a ballot. I don't even want to send in a new form, and we can't even do that right now. We can't, which I think hurts turnout. I mean, if you forget to send us the form, we can't mail you a ballot. Now, on internet voting, everybody thinks the internet is this horrible, horrible place that's just, you know, infected with viruses, and we talked about this for hours over the weekend at the conference I was at, and you know, everybody in here pays their bills online. You go to your bank account online. So what's so scary about voting? But the minute you bring up voting, people just freak out, and not over the internet. Well, you know, you're fine making all these purchases, and like I said, you know, how often do you put your bank account number out on the internet? Probably once a week, once a month to buy something. So, but you're, you know, so scared to vote. And, you know, I understand people are worried that, well, what about the returns and this or that? But you're not worried about somebody stealing your credit card out there. I mean, you might be a little bit, but so at the end of the day, I think, you know, The guy we were just talking to this past weekend, he has a 3-year-old son, and he goes, I guarantee you by the time he's 18, there will be states somewhere in the US that allow internet voting. He didn't pick which ones, but I hope Iowa was one of them.
Okay, well, we have come to the end of our session. I have a good idea for what we'll do next year. We might do, what if everyone voted online? Some audience members who might be able to contribute to that discussion. I'd like to thank you all for showing up and asking good questions and helping us have a good conversation. And we should give our panelists a round of applause.
And just a quick wrap up. First, I'd like to thank Leslie Gammon and her assistant Stephen Williams for their help in putting all this second, we've already been getting people that have been coming with suggestions like what if everyone voted online for a series for next year. So if you do have ideas or thoughts on ways that we can continue this and continue the discussion, or ways that we can improve the format or anything like that, please email those to us at the Public Policy Center. We would love to hear from you, and thank you for everybody who's been coming to these events.